Welcome to our kitchen. Today we prepare a medieval apple pie. We start with ingredients. We need different kinds of apples, white wheat flour, honey, olive oil, and the spices, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and saffron. First, we grind in the mortar the nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon. The author tells us to use saffron and other sweet spices. We chose among the spices that the medieval cooks describe as sweet, or include in their sweet spices mix. To this you can also add ginger, which is often listed among the sweet spices. This recipe is part of a Latin cookbook titled Registrum Coquine, written in the first half of the 15th century by the German cook Johannes Bockenheim, who worked in Rome for Pope Martin V. We steep the saffron in warm water. Saffron is one of the most common spices in the medieval cookbooks. It was widely cultivated in Italy since the antiquity, but to meet the high demand, it was also imported. Now we peel and slice the apples. The author suggests using several varieties of apples to give complexity to the flavor of the pie. You can use any kind of apple. Pietro de Crescenzi, in his agriculture treatise, written at the beginning of the 13th century, describes several varieties of apples that ripen in June, July, or even in winter. There are many kinds of apples, red, yellow, and green, sweet or sour, big, medium-sized, or small. The author points out that the apples must be cut thin like a roast. It is interesting to note that in medieval Latin, at least in most cookbooks and medical sources, the word for apple is pomum, while in classical Latin pomum is a more generic term that means fruit, and the word for apple is malum. We pour in a pan the olive oil and add the apples and spices. Saffron appears in a great part of the recipes of this and other cookbooks, even in the ones dedicated to common people, to testimony the huge diffusion of this spice. Renaissance authors, for example Costanzo Felici, author of a book about vegetables, recalls that saffron appeared in the most part of the dishes and was used every day in all the kitchens. This recipe is intended for the lean days, which means the days of a religious fast. In other recipes meant for the fat days, this author uses butter or lard instead of olive oil. If you prefer, you can substitute olive oil with another cooking fat. You find other recipes for the lean days in the description below. Meanwhile, we knead the flour with 2 pinches of salt and warm water. We used about 300 grams of flour, but the quantity depends on the size of your pan. Italian medieval cookbooks don't provide the basic recipe for the pie crust, But we know from Renaissance sources that usually this kind of pie was made with a simple thin sheet of pasta, similar to the sheet for the lasagna, prepared with just flour and water, sometimes adding eggs, rose water or saffron to color it. We divide the dough into two pieces, one bigger for the bottom crust and one smaller for the upper crust. We roll the bigger piece of dough until we obtain a thin sheet. During the Middle Ages in Italy, there are two main types of pies with different kinds of crust. One is a thin sheet of dough such as the one used to make pasta. This type of pie was called a torta. The other kind of pie, called pastello, has a thicker crust, usually made adding also eggs and lard or another fat. The pie we're preparing today is a torta, and therefore it has a thin crust. A few months ago we made a pastello, a thick crust shrimp pie. You find the link to the video in the description below. And also an example of another torta, in this case a chicken pie. It is interesting to note that the medieval cooks give for granted how to make the crust. Indeed, the medieval cookbooks are addressed to professional cooks who knew how to make the crust, just mentioning the type of pie. However, in the Renaissance, we find several detailed descriptions of different pie crusts, which help us to better understand the recipes of the previous centuries. We grease the pie pan with olive oil. In this case too, you can use butter or lard instead, depending on if you prefer a fat dish or a lean dish. We place the bottom crust on the pie pan and arrange it carefully. We cut and remove the excess part. We roll the smaller dough and cut it to about the same size as the pan. We suggest rolling the upper crust a bit thinner than the bottom crust, in particular if in your oven the fire is below the pie. The author suggests for which social class, profession or nationality each recipe of his cookbook is more suitable. In this case he recommends this apple pie for peasants. We find this custom also in other older cookbooks, such as the Libro de Coquine, written in Latin between the 13th and the 14th century, and the 13th century vernacular Tuscan manuscript, conventionally called Anonimo Toscano. Then we add the apples. This pie is supposed to be quite thin, to reach a good balance between the filling, the crusts, and the onion that will drizzle on the upper crust. In addition, we suggest preparing a dough not excessively hard. A soft crust will absorb the flavors of the filling perfectly. We place the upper crust and seal the pie. There is no need to cut the upper crust precisely the same size of the pie. because the bottom crust will cover the edge of the upper crust when you seal the pie. We cook the pie in the oven for about 20 minutes. The cooking time may change depending on the size of the pie and the thickness of the crust. In any case, being the filling already cooked, you just need to cook the crust. When it is cooked through, the pie is done. We pour the honey on the upper crust. We suggest not to exceed with honey, being the pie is so thin it can easily become too sweet. This delicious and aromatic pie is a great example of a simple dessert for the lean days, according to the medieval religious prescriptions, suitable for the tables of both noble and common people. If you're interested in ancient foods and flavors, or you're just looking for unusual and delicious recipes, please subscribe our channel.